Guys, before we begin our lesson today, I just want to kind of review with you some of the things that we have been learning in this unit for our nonfiction reading. If you remember, we began by talking about how important it is to make a connection to the text before we begin reading, because making that connection is going to help us, because it's going to give us a purpose. It's going to give us a reason for reading it. Because when we read nonfiction, we're reading for a different purpose. We're reading to learn something. So we're reading intensely. We're searching for things that we want to learn about a topic. We also learned that we preview our text. We look at it first to kind of see the way that it's going to go. This helps us with expectations. This helps us to comprehend. Then we also learned, how do we take notes? How do we know what notes to take? And remember, we watched the short news clip about the Arabian oryx. And during that news clip, we realized that we really don't know what the author thinks is important until we identify the text structure. And when we identify the text structure, then suddenly it becomes very easy for us to know what kind of notes we should take. It may even give us an indication of how we should take those notes. For example, if it's a compare and contrast text structure, we might make a Venn diagram. Okay? All right, so we also learned earlier this week that nonfiction reading has challenges to it. Remember, we have those confused headings that aren't really doing what they're supposed to do and telling us what things are about. We have unexpected twists and turns, those detours where they start talking about unrelated material. And we talked about the strategies that we had for fixing those kinds of things. Today, what I want to teach you is what to do and how to navigate something that we call a hybrid text. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a hybrid car. What is a hybrid car, Levi? It can do what?
It's a car that's kind of weird.
Well, it is a car that's kind of weird. Does anybody know why they call it a hybrid? Amelia? You're right, it does. It powers in an unusual way, an unexpected way. It is powered by both gasoline and electric power. Okay, so, and it alternates between, so it's more efficient. Okay, now, using that kind of background knowledge, when we think about a hybrid text is written in more than one style. When you're reading nonfiction, you expect it to be written in an expository way. It's giving you facts, it's giving you details. Maybe it's giving you information along a timeline in the order that events occur. Maybe it's giving you a description. Maybe like our little news clip, it is giving you a problem and then how it was solved. Okay? We expect that. But sometimes, especially recently, we come across hybrid nonfiction texts that contain both a narrative style and an expository. Now, a narrative is like a story. Look at the chart that you've glued in your journal. Narrative reads like a story with characters, with a setting, maybe a problem and a solution. Whereas an expository tells us all about a topic. It gives us main ideas and details. It gives us facts. Some texts do both. Lauren Tarshis, who is the author of the series I Survived, also is the managing editor and a writer for the magazine Storyworks. And you may have used it in third grade, but the Storyworks magazine contains nonfiction text that contains both types. Okay, somebody is playing with their glue stick and I need you to stop. Thank you. It contains both narrative and expository. Lauren Tarshis' son, okay, has a learning disability and really didn't want to do any reading. It was really hard for him. She got him to read by writing hybrid text about nonfiction topics. She would weave the story into the text so that he would be interested in it. He would be drawn into it so that he would want to read it. And a lot of times that's what an author of a hybrid text will do. They want you to weave the story in with the facts because we remember story. We remember stories. That way, instead of lots and lots of blocks of facts and events and information overload, you get a chance to kind of rest your brain a little bit when you get to the story part or the narrative part. Okay? Now, as good readers of nonfiction, what we have to remember is that when we get to a narrative part, when we start recognizing that we have drifted over into story, we have to put on a different lens. You might have remembered your teacher talking about putting a lens on, right? Putting a pair of glasses on, looking at it in a certain way. So when you get to the part where it's story, you're going to want to read it like a story. You're going to want to realize, okay, this is a story that might contain some facts. However, these facts may not be as important as the facts that appear in the expository. So when you drift out of the story and back into the expository, then you should be like, okay, I'm ready to take notes. These are going to be some facts and details that I need to know. All right, so I'm going to take one moment because I can still hear somebody's glue stick. If you have your glue stick on top of your desk, please put it inside your desk. Hands on top of your desk for me. Eyes on the screen. Let's go ahead and take a look at a sample piece of text so that I can show you what I'm talking about. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, this is from Storyworks magazine. I love these magazines. They contain both nonfiction and fiction, and they do paired passages. Today we're going to read from this article, this nonfiction article. It is by Lauren Tarshis. It's called The Volcano That Changed the World. Now, as we read together, all right, we're going to notice the shifts in the type of writing. Okay? Now, the tricky part here is that we're not talking about text structure. We're not talking about chronological or sequential order. We're not talking about comparing and contrasting. We're talking about the difference between story and expository facts. So story, facts, and details. All right, so let's watch for that and see if we can identify. The volcano that changed the world. 200 years ago, an unknown volcano caused death and destruction around the world. 10-year-old John Hoisington stared in shock out the window of his family's Vermont farmhouse. It was June 8, 1816. Summer was just 2 weeks away. Yet outside, a wild winter snowstorm was raging. Nearly a foot of snow covered the fields the family had planted only weeks before. The family's vegetable garden was buried. The apple and pear trees shivered in the freezing wind, their delicate buds coated with ice. All right, stop for a second. Think about that text. Which of our two types of writing is this an example of? Where are we? Should we have our narrative lens on or should we have our expository lens on? Dylan? Narrative. It reads like a story. Can everybody see how it reads like a story? Okay? I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. Like most people in 1816, the Hoisingtons grew almost everything they ate. Practically every bite of the family's food came from the farm, from the corn in their morning porridge to the chicken and potatoes in the suppertime stew. John saw the look of fear in his father's eyes as they watched the snow swirling outside. This storm would kill all of their crops. There would be little food for the family or their animals. Okay, stop for a second. What type of writing is this, Fiona? What type of writing is it? Say it again. It's still narrative. It's still story. Okay, it's still story. How would they survive? What John and his family didn't know was that during that strange summer in 1816, similar weather disasters were unfolding throughout New England and the world. Snow destroyed thousands of other East Coast farms from Virginia up to Maine. Snowstorms and floods struck France, England, Ireland, and Switzerland. There were droughts and floods in India and killing frosts across northern China. Okay, stop for a second. Consider that paragraph. What style of writing is this, Isabella? Yes, it's expository. See, now we've shifted from the story about John and his family. We've shifted. Now we're getting all kinds of facts. So when I'm reading nonfiction, I have to recognize that I'm shifting out of that story, that narrative style, into expository. This is where important information is going to be. This is where I need to start jotting down some notes. Okay? This is where I need to be paying close attention to the research aspect of what I'm reading. What am I learning about? I'm learning in this paragraph right here that in 1816 there were weather problems throughout the world. Okay, let me continue. At the time, people struggled to understand what had caused the weather to change so wildly. Were witches to blame? It is only now, nearly 200 years later, that scientists have finally solved the mystery. Very likely, John Hoisington and his family would have been astonished to learn the truth. The cause of their family's suffering was an event that took place a year earlier and 10,000 miles away from their farm. It all started with a volcano called Mount Tambora. All right, so what style of writing is this, Preston? It's still expository, so I have to be reading it with my expository lens. I have to be paying close attention to details. If I were jotting down notes, I definitely would have Mount Tambora on there. Mount Tambora sits on the island of Sumbawa, which today is part of the nation of Indonesia. In 1815, perhaps 50,000 people lived on Sumbawa, a beautiful land of rushing streams, gentle hills, and thick villages. Looming over the northern side of the island was Mount Tambora, a quiet mountain dotted with villages and rice farms. Nobody had any reason to suspect that the peaceful mountain was in fact a volcano, that underneath its velvety green slopes were snaking tunnels filled with lava and explosive gases. Like many volcanoes, Tambora looked like an ordinary mountain and had been dormant, quiet, for centuries. But on April 5th, 1815, Tambora woke up. Okay, so Donovan, what kind of writing is this part? What style? We're talking about narrative, which is story-like, or we're talking about expository, which is facts and details. What do you think? Can somebody help him out? Ava, you want to help him out? It's still expository. It's giving us information, right? We need to be reading it with a lens for learning. right? We're learning something. It's giving us facts and details. We know that Mount Tambora did not look like a volcano. We know that it had been dormant for centuries. The first eruption shook the island and sent up great plumes of fire and ash, and that was nothing compared to what would come 5 days later on April 10th. Okay, Donovan, what do you think? Has it shifted or is it still expository? It's still expository. Kaboom! The volcano exploded with terrible fury, spewing out great towers of fire. A tremendous cloud of gas and ash shot high into the sky. The day turned midnight black, but the mountain glowed red as rivers of lava gushed down the slopes. The eruption went on for more than 3 days. A deadly storm of fire, gas, ash, and rock. In the eruption's terrifying final stage, a wave of flames and gases swept down the mountain at speeds of 400 miles per hour. This pyroclastic surge devastated everything in its path. We're going to come back to that word, pyroclastic, in our next lesson. The eruption instantly killed at least 12,000 people living on and around Mount Tambora. Ash and lava ruined the island's soil and poisoned its rivers and streams. Rice paddies were destroyed. No fruits or vegetables would grow. There were no fish to catch. Almost every animal had been killed. Trapped without food on their ruined lands, more than 90,000 people on Sumbawa and the nearby island of Lombok slowly starved to death. What style of writing, Connor, is this? Expository, that's right. So were you taking notes? I could see you jotting things down. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 was the most deadly and powerful volcanic eruption in human history. Its explosive energy was 10 times stronger than that of Krakatoa, history's most famous volcano, which erupted in 1883, also in what is now Indonesia. And yet, incredibly, few people outside the blast zone learned about this terrible disaster. The people of Sumbawa and surrounding islands led simple lives. Few of them had any connections to far-off lands like Europe or the Americas. Some British sailors witnessed the eruption, but news and information traveled very slowly in 1815. The only way to get a letter or a person across oceans was on a sailing ship. The voyage from Sumbawa to New York or London would have taken perhaps 4 months. Eventually, reports of the eruption did make it back to England, but few people paid attention. Somehow, the deadliest volcano in history was ignored by most of the world and then forgotten. What people were paying attention to a year later, in 1816, was the terrible weather. Snowstorms in the summer, floods that turned wheat fields into lakes, frosts that blackened millions of acres of farmland around the world. Farmers up and down the East Coast lost their crops. In Europe, I didn't have that brought down for you. In Europe, farmers grew desperate. In Paris, mobs of people broke into warehouses where grain was stored, risking their lives to steal sacks of flour. In China, starving families could no longer feed their children. Floods in India triggered an outbreak of a disease called cholera, which killed millions. In 1816, not even the most brilliant scientists would have believed that these weather problems were somehow connected, that all these disasters had been caused by the eruption of a volcano few had heard of. Little was known about climate or volcanoes, but today scientists know that volcanoes can have a major impact on weather worldwide. They have learned by studying recent volcanic eruptions like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. Scientists monitored every phase of Pinatubo's eruption in June 1991. It was not as powerful as Tambora, but the eruption was monstrous, one of the most powerful since Krakatoa. Okay. Just as a quick check, what kind of writing is this? What style of writing is this? Riley, what do you think?
Expository.
It's still expository. I can see a lot of you are taking notes. That's really good. Using satellites and computers, scientists tracked the volcano's huge eruption cloud as it rose into the sky. Most volcanic clouds quickly dissipate, break apart, and fade away. But in a very powerful eruption, the cloud rises so high that it mixes with water and other gases in the stratosphere. It turns into a foam and remains high in the sky. Scientists observed Pinatubo's cloud as it spread across the world. Like a layer of sunscreen slathered across the sky, the cloud blocked out some of the sun's heat and light. Temperatures dropped, and storms became more violent. It took 3 years for Pinatubo's foamy haze to clear. Tambora's cloud would have been even bigger, its effects more devastating. Indeed, like an invisible beast, Tambora's cloud hovered in the sky for about 3 years. By the time the climate returned to normal, as many as 30 million people had died from Tambora's effects. Eli, what do you think? Are we still in expository or have we shifted to narrative? What makes you think that? Is it reading like a story? Or are they still giving you facts and details? It's still a story. It's still facts and details, right? So it's still expository. And many more lives, like the Hossingtons, had been forever changed. John and his family survived the loss of their crops, but they gave up their farm and moved west to Ohio. Harper, what do you think? Oh, Harper's still in the bathroom. Fiona. Now we're shifting back to story, right? Okay, so what you've learned today, that's very important, is that as a reader of nonfiction, you have to watch for shifts in the style of writing. You have to watch for hybrid text that shifts from story to expository, from narrative, story-like reading, to expository with facts and details. And you're going to want to make sure that when you go into that expository, you're reading with a lens for note-taking. Because remember, when we're reading nonfiction, we are focusing on trying to make sure that we are learning something. All right. The standard we're working on, if you remember correctly, and what we're working towards here, on the test that we took, it asks you to be able to write a summary. All right? And when you're writing that summary, the first part of writing a summary is to analyze the parts. So what are the parts of the text? So if we went back and we looked at this article, we could definitely code it. We could code it with parts that were narrative and parts that were expository. So do you remember the question on the test where they asked you about the part of the article? The pretest, when we took the pretest, it said, read the first 2 paragraphs. What part does it play in the overall article? Okay, so that's the standard we're working on, to analyze the parts of the text and to know what purpose they serve. Okay, so from now on, whenever you're reading nonfiction text, you need to be watching for shifts in the style of writing. Okay, go ahead and